They do not want you.
While critically praised across the internet, getting 8s and 9s from most major publications, Diablo 4 has had much more mixed responses from players. And as with other games in the franchise, this is not as much due to the game content as it is tied to the fact that it wears the Diablo name and expectations. But that begs the question, which is it? Game of the Year like these publications seem to lead us to believe, or a painful deviation from the formula that should be derided like the saltiest players say? And the reality is, as with most things, somewhere in between, with bits and pieces that are amazing for the player, while others are pure games as a service rot. And as someone not really beholden to Blizzard or the weight of their social media team, I think it's time to look at both. Starting out in Diablo 4, you are greeted by the usual introductory cutscene done extremely well in the Blizzard cinematic style, then prompted to create your first character, the standard jazz and what anyone who has played a Diablo game before will expect. Character customization is there, letting you choose gender, and from a handful of preset hair, eye, and skin colors, and some adornments like tattoos, jewelry, and a beard, but lacking much in the way of depth beyond these extreme basics. And you are zoomed in far enough while playing that you will notice these things, at least the hair and skin, on other players. And with in-engine cinematics being part of the game, your character will appear in them how you designed them. In fact, immediately after character creation, you are dropped into one, where your horse gets eaten and you're introduced to your first ominous character in the form of an undead wolf. And those who tried the public test weekends, this will all seem familiar. And Act 1 itself is relatively unchanged from what you experienced then, with the story of the Church of Anarius being the main driving force, a spattering of side quests across the region, and the dungeons you probably did an irresponsible amount of times if you played during those events. And each act follows this structure as expected, while introducing new characters to tie into the story to the region, and even introduce you to some old friends, some of whom I'm surprised are not dead since they would be probably over 100 years old at this point. But we needed those nods back to the classics, right? But either way, in terms of story quality, I'll try and keep the spoilers to a minimum, but the first and last acts are easily the strongest in terms of how much they try to invest you in the story, how they advance the plot, and just generally in pacing as well. Acts 2 through 5, though, are a bit more of a mixed bag, with a decent amount of MacGuffins, backtracking, and the tired trope of, well, that didn't work, time for plan B, basically on repeat, to the point where it tends to get a bit grating at times. Now, are they bad? No, but definitely not as engaging as some other games I've played that had similar world-ending foes we were pursuing and needed to come up with multiple approaches for. This is because we don't really make much progress until near the very end, rather than making small amounts of progress in each step. That said, while Act 6 was the strongest of the batch, it weirdly also drew out a reflection of just how much faffing had gone on in the previous acts, since as is a normal thing in a lot of RPGs, you do get a moment of reflection trope, and it all but acknowledges how insignificant the redundancies were by only hitting the key moments you'll remember from each of the acts. That will thankfully hit you in the feels if you let it, which is a good thing, but it shows just how little world advancement happened in those sections. As far as the ending goes, probably the least spoilery answer I can give is that you can absolutely tell an expansion is planned, and it does fairly blatantly point you towards what that expansion will entail, even pretty much telling us where that expansion will take us. Though I do wonder how long the gaps for that will be, and it is worth noting they did miss a few spots whenever it comes to removing old instances of our allies from towns too, so don't be shocked when you run into people who shouldn't be there in town. But stepping aside from the main story, we can go back and look at the side quests, at least the game progression side quests. They range from fairly bog standard kill or collect X number of Y type deals all the way up to actually enjoyable mini stories in and of themselves, and each region has a mixed flavor of these. And you will eventually want to do them all if you're planning to do the 100% run of the game, since they give you progress towards what is known as renown in the region, which serves to give account-wide bonuses like plus skills, potion slots, paragon points, and increasing your opal capacity, which we'll get into at a moment. Now, you get similar progress on Renown for revealing new locations in a region, getting waypoints, and clearing strongholds, which generally just turn into additional towns, and you also get it for doing dungeons and finding Lilith statues, these last two providing account-wide bonuses in and of themselves, as well in the form of unlocks in the dungeons, and plus stats and other perks from the Lilith statues. While fun on some levels, these do eventually fall into the realm of just being checkboxes for me, sadly. And by the end, most people will end up just using a number of guide maps to fill them out, since there are 160 Lilith statues and 115 aspects to unlock as of release, which will take a bit of time to do, and I've admittedly not finished all of them as of writing this, but likely will over the course of the next week or so as we round out our main character and start in on secondary ones to take advantage of all those unlocks. Though it is worth keeping in mind that these need to be done separately for hardcore and softcore, so no cheesing hardcore with it, you gotta start over. That said, it is also worth noting, to get all the bonuses, you need to unlock World Tier 3, so that involves beating the game and doing the first of 2 capstone dungeons, which are mildly challenging. Though I admittedly did the first one somewhat underleveled, so was into World Tier 3 several levels before 50. So it might be easier if you go for a more completionist run up to it, so you'll be more well into your 50s and level appropriate. Now, if you do all that and still want to pursue more stuff, the post-game, in the form of whispers, will generate randomized time quests for you to do, which are mostly just kill X of Y style quests, sadly, sometimes a boss hunt, but very much procedurally generated style deals, and these give you bonuses for clearing 10 points worth of them. You also end up getting Hell Tides, which engulf regions of the map and provide an extra challenging zone to fight in with better rewards, though you also get that through Nightmare Dungeons, which are basically just upscaled versions of dungeons you cleared earlier. Overall, though, I'd say the postgame in this regard is at least more reasonable than is a number of other games for me, since more often than not, other titles focus on ripping you out of the world into an adjacent realm or rift or anything like that, and this one at least tries an in-world approach that I appreciate, even if it still suffers from similar repetitiveness and lack of puzzle elements or story progression challenges. Now, you can actually start these post-game effects at level 1 with new characters if you've beaten the game already on your account and don't want to do the story again. So if you enjoy the postgame more than the story, it's easy enough to get to, and yes, you'll have access to all the side quests again, just not the main one, which I think is a good thing even if I won't take advantage of it, since I'm a sucker for seeing my characters in cinematics, even if they are a bit on the janky side. Probably the last post-game thing would be world events, world bosses, etc. Those crop up all over the map, though specific bosses are of course going to be in specific locations, and you can see them spawning on the world map when you bring it up and charge for them. Though I'm not sure at this time if they're on a specific cycle or not, since I only ran across one over the weekend and it was mostly on accident since I was not actively looking for them. Though it is worth noting that they supposedly only spawn after you've beaten the campaign, and you need to beat them to farm certain crafting materials. And there is of course also PvP to do, but honestly I kinda swore off PvP years ago, so you'll need to go to a channel more oriented towards that for advice there. I don't have a problem with PvP, it just brings out a bad side of me, so I don't do it anymore. But there is a currency associated with it as well, so we'll see if that draws me into it eventually, but it's never going to be a main thing for me, and I can skip it. Now, all of this probably sounds fairly standard and mostly enjoyable, and for the most part it is, though where we start getting into the weeds of things is that they just don't quite mesh as well as they sound. We have the actual progression and gameplay systems to thank for that. That said, weirdly enough, there's not much to say about the combat itself though, outside of the skill progression, since it's fairly standard and 100% fine as far as things go. Numbers-wise, just remember it's multiplier-based, and things will scale exponentially later. And beyond that, you've got a dodge, you'll eventually get a steed that can be somewhat fiddly at times to navigate, and you have your abilities. The battle feels fine from an input and output perspective, but it does get a bit weird whenever you use it for progression, since you will stick with the same skills for most of the game. This is because for character building, the skill tree tends to feel a little flat. First off, you have a limited skill bar, so you're going to be limited to a handful of skills on any given build. Usually a basic attack, a right-click attack, then a handful of support or heavy-hitting skills with cooldowns. Any build ideas that use more than this limited number of skills will be impossible to play. And I did run into this especially noteworthy way with the Necromancer, since your summons use up 2 of these slots if you want to utilize them. One for skeletons and magi, and the other one for golems. Or if I want to troll people, the Jolem. I know, it's Golem. And no, hot swapping isn't really viable due to the durations not being exceptionally long on any given ability, though even without this, you'll find that a variety of skills isn't really there. Yes, we have a decent number of options, but due to the skill selection being an investment-based system rather than level-based, you'll have to pick up a certain number of points at previous levels, meaning everyone will be using a specific low-level skill even in the end game, especially due to the resource systems pretty much mandating it. Though on the flip side, this does mean all the plus skills you unlock through renown and such make it to new characters, and they can progress a decent way into the skill tree even at level 1. Probably the last thing that is irking people about the skill tree is that you don't really feel the upgrades you get for the most part, at least not during normal progression, since most of the game is balanced towards the end game thanks to how it functions with stacking multipliers. So those 5 points in an ability are only going to feel slightly stronger than the 1 point starting out, but in the end game it will make a much bigger difference to your damage output due to the multiplier stacking, but when you're going through the story, you're not going to feel it. There's also the oddity due to how the game progression goes. Until you hit that level 50 mark for Paragon points, you won't start hitting the curve to feel powerful compared to enemies. Since, yes, you're investing these skill points you get from levels, and you can get a little ahead of the curve provided you get the equipment to match if you build up your renown and such, but you will feel either the same or even slightly weaker as you continue to level and get these points, since the endgame is balanced around Paragon multipliers and endgame gear, and it kind of ramps everything up based on your level instead. This is an issue that presses through the entire game though, with, as hinted, equipment can very easily cause issues while progressing if you're unable to keep your attack power and defense appropriate for your level. Since there was a span of time in our 30s during the streams where everything was just super spongy because the game just would not drop me a better weapon. And even a small spot of time where everything was chunking my life down because my defensive stats had not kept up with the level curve. And no, you cannot just go farm lower level areas since, while areas have minimum levels, they do not have a maximum level. The best you can hope for is scaled to your level. So you will hit these speed bumps unless you are very lucky with drops, or more likely just pass gear down to your new characters from one character that struggled through it already. So your first run through, you need to use those obols to gamble for the hope of getting the items you need to smooth the curve a little bit. Though you could be unlucky like we were and just get garbage after burning your full stock of obols, which are the only way to gamble for items. As far as how level scaling works, you can have 4 characters looking at the same enemy and have it be a different level for each of them. So you will run into situations where a level 14 character who has not had time for the gap to progress between their level and their equipment, and they'll be doing more damage than the level 30 character in the same zone, resulting in, at least during progression rather than the post-game, a situation where you can easily end up feeling weaker over time rather than stronger. And in conjunction with this, you need to just flat out not bother getting attached to items until you hit level cap as well, since you will need to keep upgrading past them to keep up with the curve for your character to do reasonable damage and maintain reasonable defense bonuses. Speaking of which, defense bonuses are weird, since they only apply a percent of their listed percentages to the damage. So you may have 50% lightning resist in World Tier 2, but it's only giving you 25% actual resistance due to how it applies. Which is still good, and you want to get as high as possible, it's just weird how it does it and a little bit counterintuitive. And sadly, the crafting system does not do much to mitigate any of this, since for a lot of crafting you need to salvage similar gear to get resources to improve them, or already be doing post-game stuff in the case of several of the options. The upgrades also generally don't seem to keep up between level gaps, so really I only found the need to upgrade stuff to cover the gaps of bad drops rather than improving already good items, and even then it didn't make up much of the span. You'll also want to salvage pretty much everything rare or higher you find unless you're really needing gold right then, since the resources you get from them are harder to come across, since normal and magic item resources can be found in the wild while you're doing your mandatory bush trimming for potions. And yes, you want to harvest all the bushes, stones, etc. you see, since the game does require those to improve your potions, items, and get you the experience boosting items as well. And if you run out, things will slow down quite a bit as you have to go back to specific areas to farm specific things. Though I have to say the weirdest thing in all of that is the scaling of the gold. Starting out a few hundred or even a few thousand gold may seem like a lot, but due to how it exponentially scales, you'll be seeing items and functions that hit ridiculous costs. Even at the mid-levels, items were hitting over 250,000 gold. You'd burn through hundreds of thousands of gold in one town trip, if not millions, and make similar back by selling an inventory of trash you brought home just for that purpose. and enemy gold drops generally start meaning jack squat outside of the jingle of loot pinatas. Weirdly, the rabbit hole of gold led me down one path that I want to gripe about though. Inventory tabs, more precisely the shared stash. The interface at first looks like it'll let you have a decent number of tabs if you have the gold, with stash naming, a plethora of icons to choose, and a scaling price, but it caps out at 4 stash tabs. So, hoarders and organizers beware. You cannot have a separate tab for organizing your gear by slot, or aspects by class, etc. I ended up just dedicating 1 to gems, 1 to generic aspects, and 1 to experience potions, and then using the 4th for storage and transfers, and just keeping everything else pocketed on my characters, which functions, but annoys my hamster brain that wants organization. Now back to items, I need to reiterate, you should know that what you find in normal outside of legendaries will generally be useless. You don't get the real endgame equipment until World Tier 4. This means no matter how much you love it for your build, it will be replaced eventually, no matter how much rerolling, repairing, and upgrading you do on it. There are no items like Mage Fists, early rune words, or the like that you will see in early game that will be with you forever and be that proud item you found. It is very much like Diablo 3 in that regard, which will upset some people and frankly just feels like bad itemization to me, since it results in zero reason to actually farm until level 100. Now, the other big thing that keeps Diablo 4 stuck in the weeds for me is the online aspect, and I'm not going to rag on it for half an hour for the fact that I hate always online, and that it's literally games as a service just to promote buying cosmetic, battle passes, etc., since those have been pounded into the ground, and most regular viewers know my opinions on that. But rather, we should look at how the multiplayer just doesn't feel like multiplayer. This is because there's very little in the way of actual multiplayer in it, outside of world events. Since if you're going into dungeons, there's no queue with randoms option, there's no looking for group options, etc. You're literally going to be entering dungeons pretty much exclusively with friends or guildmates that you can schedule to join you. Though on the plus side, the tryhard grinders that already are at a level 100 can still group with their friends that are still level 10, and things will scale to those players individually. So neither character will feel left behind just because they have different time available. This is compounded by the fact that there's also very little communication, though this is more due to a mix of cross-platform play as well as modern online gaming just being less communicative than it was in the 90s and early 2000s. People just don't chat as much in-game, instead opting for outside tools like streaming and community formats like Discord. I can't really blame Diablo 4 for this part, but it does impact the more casual multiplayer aspects of the title, and is one reason why that random pairing needs to be a thing. Now, I'm sure I've forgotten something in the rest of this video, since I'm still in a fugue state from burning through this game in an unreasonably short amount of days for the first time, while trying to do a variety of side and endgame content. But those were the high points that stuck out to me in terms of the core game, and are pretty much the reasons why I say it's a good game in general and a good action RPG compared to other games as a service titles, but it is a bit hit or miss for a Diablo game. And it's probably not worth $70, especially since the $25 cosmetics and upcoming seasonal battle pass are cropping up. But it's still not worth throwing in the trash, since there is a lot to enjoy here and may be worth it whenever you get it on a discount. Now, before we leave though, since you see there are several minutes of this left, I do have a few irks, bugs, and recommendations that could still further scrape your brain a bit before you buy it. Starting with the bugs, the in-engine cinematics frequently get bothered by in-world effects, like spells and aggro-dropping graphics, and there were a few occasions where the game would lock me out of using skills, portals, or dodge for unknown reasons until I log out and back in, which made me redo entire dungeons a few times. In terms of irks, there's weird gaps in pacing, with whole stretches of the story segments having absolutely no enemies and almost no dialogue, and characters alternating between dialogue felt like it had just been hours since the last event, while others made it sound like it had been months or years with the phrasing. There were even a couple points where it feels like the cinematics had parts cut out, or in the case of one towards the very end of the game, where it felt like it had a whole segment shoved in, since the grammar just kinda broke in the middle of the scene. And I also have a weird annoyance at some differences in the beta versus the release, since it feels like they actually stripped some tools and options from the beta before release. Probably the most noteworthy one being a proper loot filter, to the point where I felt like I was gaslighting myself into thinking there was one before, but even other players noticed its conspicuous removal and mentioned it in chat. Now, in terms of recommendations, I would love to see more thought put into the low and mid-level play, especially with level scaling of zones, perhaps giving Tier 1 fixed levels in each region, Tier 2 having scaling to a regional cap outside of dungeons, and then saying sky's the limit for scaling in Tier 3 and 4, where most of the grinding will occur. This way you don't suffer as hard from gear droughts making everything spongy, and you'll still have spots you can go to feel how much more your potency has grown from the early game, rather than frankly ultra flat or even degrading feelings of power currently. I also hope they eventually introduce some form of rewarding early game itemization, things that could be useful into the end game, that are more than just one use like aspects are, since with those you're pretty much having to balance augmenting your abilities now with being able to use them in the end game. But I would love to have something I found low level that was like, hey, this is my cool item I've had since I was level 5. As it stands, the game feels very much designed around the end game, balanced around the end game, and treats players like they're always playing for the end game, which pulls you out of the actual game in a few places. And that is probably my biggest gripe as someone who enjoys and appreciates world building, theory crafting, and design, rather than the mindless grind for hundreds or thousands of hours. It feels very much like the story, while good, was designed and considered at best secondary to all of this, which results in the overall vibe of the post-game with a good enough game attached, rather than a great game with a solid post-game attached, which is my personal preference. And this is why there's a reason I can go back and enjoy Chrono Trigger or Diablo 2 multiple times or many other games from that era and consider them classics, even though the stories are still the same, while I have barely been able to get myself to log into Path of Exile for more than a few hours since the Fall of Oriath expansion. We can make great games and great experiences that stick with people, but the game needs to come first, not the microtransactions and not the post-game grind. Now, I can see myself beating the game on a few characters here, though whether I'll bother with the endless grind at the end, it's a maybe, though probably only on my Necromancer to prepare for the expansion. All that said, if you want to see where Diablo started, check out the video on screen, and if you found this informative, entertaining, or helpful, play with those buttons under the video since they help out quite a bit.